Doo-doo-dee. It's Nandi!
Hello friends, my most popular series is back, the Dirty Dozen, for another update. These have been popular tier list videos since my channel's inception, and I tend to update them after a new guild boss or meta event. The Dirty Dozen uses 3 key metrics to evaluate characters: guild raids, guild war, and horde mode, a term I've coined to describe performance in wave-based modes like legendary release events and survival. The idea is to allow you, the viewer, to maximize your investment and gain rewards. If you don't like that sort of min-max strategy, that's fine. I'm just warning you about the nature of this video and its content. As with all of my Dirty Dozen videos, you have the opportunity to win some character shards by leaving a comment in the video below. For those that don't win the character shards, there is still a code that everyone can benefit from. Thanks as always for your support. A lot has happened since my last video. We've had a host of new characters, some reworks, and the introduction of the Riptide raid boss. Mythic is too recent of an addition, and relics make the playing field imbalanced, so for now we are excluding Mythic and relics from our considerations. We'll start with a brief general overview of things. This was last edition's Dirty Dozen, and now we have the current edition. We'll talk about all 12 characters, and I'll use terms like the Mech Team and the Custodes Team, but don't worry, I'll come back to that in the raid section later. Let's start with the easy stuff. The Mech Team remains excellent. The weighting for the Dirty Dozen is 60% on raid performance, and the reason for this is that I still think raids are the most valuable mode in the game, despite the redistribution of resources through different shops in the latest Mythic Economy patch. Raids are ever present, and the returns on investing in a few raid characters are huge compared to comparable investment for characters in modes like Horde or War. The Mech Team is the strongest raid team by a considerable margin against most bosses. The Dirty Dozen updates are driven by new raid bosses, and it looks like people have been figuring out some good strategies with the Mech Team. This replay shows the Mech Team performing very well against the Riptide boss. This boss's movements can be anticipated such that you can get row into the high ground and do a big sequence of damage. For now, the mechs remain raid stalwarts, and particularly in the cases of Tangita and Actus, are pretty good in modes like War and Horde Mode too, justifying their places in the Dirty Dozen. I spent a long time in my last Dirty Dozen talking about Gulgortz, and he remains an incredibly powerful character. If I'm being honest, I think Snowprint made him a little bit too strong with the rework. Let's recap what we can do with his active. He summons 2 units, he makes 3 units on your team immediately take an action, he gives a movement bonus to several units on your team, and he gives extra damage and hits to several units on your team too. Individually, nothing here is overpowered, but when you add them all together, you have a unit that basically does everything. Add to that he's a mechanical unit and therefore complements the strongest raid team in the game, and his passive triggers another chain of Exeter Rose attacks. You'll struggle to find better investment choices. I'm not going to labour the point, but if you haven't already, I would encourage you to check out the tips I left in my last Dirty Dozen, where I specifically talk about summon sequencing for Gulgortz. Kharn is another character whose stock has risen this patch because of his place within the Custodes team. He isn't an integral cog, but he does a lot of damage because of how he synergizes with Dante and Trajann. He's great in War too, slightly less so in Horde modes, but makes the Dirty Dozen largely on the back of his raid utility. Sho'Syl is another quick one. Historically a big part of mech teams, but has fallen away a little bit and has been somewhat replaced by Trajann and Gulgortz. He still has a role, but it's smaller and more niche within that team. Sho'Syl is probably the best character in the game in war defense, and his drones are also excellent in horde mode, so he hangs on to his Dirty Dozen spot, but has dropped a few ranks. Ragnar is pretty straightforward. There isn't a more powerful active in the game in terms of raw damage that it adds to your characters, and I don't think it's possible to build a melee raid team without at least thinking about him. Even in the Custodes team, a team I'm really excited about, he doesn't fit the conventional strengths of the team, but makes his way in there by virtue of his incredible active, which remains really powerful despite the nerf earlier in this year. Up next, Snotflogga makes an appearance. Truth be told, the conventional multi-hit team has seen a drop in popularity and power with some of the newer characters that we've seen since the last Dirty Dozen. Snotflogga is still a fine choice as you're transitioning your roster from middle to end game, but the reason I love Snot and have invested in him and his skills to Mythic as a priority is because of how good he is in War and Horde mode. I don't think I'm overvaluing him when I give him a 5 in those modes. His grots are really strong as distractors and deal reasonable damage. With the old characters out of the way, we can talk about the 4 new additions to the Dirty Dozen. It should come as no great surprise that Kariyan enters the Dirty Dozen, given how powerful the character is, especially within the Custodes team. I've dedicated an entire video extolling the virtues of that team and how to maximize them. In essence, Kariyan does a huge amount of damage on turn 6, and you want to set him up to get high ground for that attack and give him as many hits as possible. That's where characters like Trajann and Dante come in. They provide those crucial bonus hits that lets Kariyan do upwards of 250,000 damage on a single hit at max settings. Raids aside, I also like Kariyan in Horde modes, where his passive does area of effect damage that helps you clear enemies in a wave-based mode. He's possibly not at his best in war, but not too shabby there either. Dante is here mainly because of how his passive fits so well with Kariyan, providing some bonus damage but crucially the extra hit when he's below 50% health. The bonus hit also applies to characters like Kharn. If you can't get Kariyan under 50% health, Dante's value diminishes quite significantly. Trajann is an interesting one. He scores well because of his role within the Custodes team, providing 2 bonus hits to the team and being a great enabler for Kariyan as well as Kharn, but what makes him interesting is within the raid framework, he also works really well within the Mech team. His passive when activated gives your units a huge damage buff, almost better than anything in the game. All you need to do is be aware of your sequencing of your actives, and you'll get a huge boost to the Mechs team's overall damage output. This damage bonus is the reason why, in certain fights, Trajann has superseded the Tau Firesight Marksman. It's curious because Eldryon was nerfed for being too universally powerful, and now Trajann fills a similar niche. The last character for the top 12 is Forcas. His time in the sun was brief but bright, as he was hailed as the new hero for the Multihit team before Snowprint revealed Kariyan. Forcas's best use is against Magnus, especially on maps with a turn 2 high ground. Here you can take advantage of the double Warhowl, secure high ground, hit twice thanks to Asmodai, and with the correct positioning also take advantage of that big chunk of damage that comes from overwatching the boss. Magnus's fight is random by design, and it can be hard to predict and optimize for an ever-changing environment. The Forcas version of the Multihit team lets you front-load all of your damage, so even if the fight goes awry later, you've still done an okay amount of damage. I'd argue that concept is probably more a function of the double Warhowl than Forcas himself, but the point still stands. He does okay against other bosses. I've seen him used well versus Ghazghkull, where you can anticipate boss positioning, or against Call, where his Overwatch can deal with the spawns that start the fight. His Overwatch is nice, particularly in Horde modes, and as a late game player who has the Custodes and Mech teams built, that's mainly the place I see myself using him. Here are the scores for the top 30 characters that didn't quite make the Dirty Dozen cut. We can see some familiar names here, and I'll talk about just a few. Probably the most notable exclusion from the Dirty Dozen is Exeter Rowe. While Rowe is a crucially important character within his raid team and does the bulk of the damage, he's actually quite poor in modes like War and Horde. That allows his teammates to usurp him in this ranking system. Tangita creates summons, and Actus and Vitruvius can repair, which add to their respective value. Archimitos is a character that I'm quite high on since his rework. In particular, his ability to make multiple summons with his active typically kills most characters of equal scaling, and then you have up to 6 Bloodletter summons left over to soak up and distract enemy attention. I think he's going to be an all-star in War and Horde modes in particular. Mephiston received 2 buffs in 2 separate patches to make the character much stronger. He now has Rapid Assault, and crucially his passive can be modified by things like Dante's passive and High Ground. For something that does psychic damage, i.e. 100% pierce that can't be blocked, that's a massive boost to damage and makes him incredible in war. He is serviceable in the Psyker Team, given his ability to add 2 stacks of the Parasite each turn, but certainly not the first name on the team sheet at the moment. Jude is a character I was initially underwhelmed by, but as time has gone on, I've come to learn just how great she is. She's pretty hard to kill in war defense, and if she gets a crit off, either through her retaliation mechanic or through her active, she can be pretty lethal. I use her on a Genestealer Cults team, both on war offense and defense, and it's one of my best performing teams. Now that we have the top 30 characters, I thought I would take a bit more time and talk about guild raid teams. By now, regular viewers of my channel will be familiar with a version of this slide, where we highlight the core characters on each team and flex slots for that team. There's always a bit of variation on the flex slot. For example, you want Gulgortz on the Mech team for bosses with lots of adds, but Helbrecht on the team for the Psyker boss. The difficulty of the boss relative to your team will also influence how well the team performs. To illustrate this, we can talk about a high-level Mortarion. The Mech Team is easily the best against this boss, but you need to have enough investment in your characters and skills just for the sliver of health to survive the enemy Primarch's attacks. I'll talk briefly about each team here. The Mechanical Team centers around exploiting Exeter Row. Each time a mechanical unit, be it a character or summon, makes an attack, Exeter Row triggers some out of turn damage. This damage can get out of control pretty quickly, especially with damage multipliers in the form of Vitruvius and Trajann. The Psyker Team asks you to use the Neurothrope as the cornerstone of the team. You build up stacks on the boss, and once you have 15 stacks of Neuroparasite, you give the Neurothrope 2 hits with Yazagor's active ability and take the high ground for a large amount of damage. The team does comparatively well against high level bosses, where boss armor that normally reduces incoming damage is ignored by the 100% pierce of psychic damage. The Multihit Team combines 2 basic principles: do lots of hits and couple it with damage buffers. If you can give your 7-hit character 1200 bonus damage, that's much more valuable than giving your 1-hit character 1200 bonus damage, even if the latter has a high base damage stat. For most players, this is the team that they will start off with in the early game, since it's easy to find characters that fit this mold. We've been over the Custodes team before, but the team is named because the bulk of the damage comes from Kariyan, who in turn is best enabled by Trajann. The other characters are good complementary characters, but could easily be replaced by better alternatives in the future. I could give you a matrix that tells you what teams are best in slot against different boss rarities, but over 82,000 people watched the last Dirty Dozen, and it's hard to give everyone something standardized. Clearly Mythic changes the playing field a little bit. We haven't had enough time or reps to fully flesh out an infographic, but I have made a best guess here with my thoughts for best teams against various bosses. A common question that I get asked is which characters are best for Horde Mode. Horde Mode has 2 flavors, survival and legendary release events. Although similar, there are differences between the two that make it slightly nuanced. For example, in legendary release events, all of the enemies come from the top of the map, which lets you set up more defensively and accumulate an army of show drones, for example. When the enemies come from all directions, you don't have the luxury of setting up defensively. Also, if you don't clear the enemies quickly, you will die to future waves as the rarities increase. The scores here hopefully take into account those different approaches, and I've done a graphic here for some of the top Horde Mode characters. There's always going to be some subjectivity with this stuff, but I think it's a reasonable list. The final thing to add when I look at a list like this is that I'm not interested in how many traits a character fulfills, but rather how well it performs in the mode, i.e. how many enemies can the character kill, how well can it survive or create summons. Okay, that was a longer one. I hope you enjoyed it. I have a Patreon if you'd like to support me and my work, but otherwise I'll see you soon. Bye for now.